In our lesson today, I'm going to give you a quick overview of Russian emperors from Paul I all the way up to the last Russian emperor, Nicholas II. But we will have a separate video about Nicholas and the end of the Russian Empire. So let's start with Paul I, the son of Catherine the Great and Peter III. Now, in many ways, Paul actually was very similar to his father. Like Peter III, Paul admired Prussian military culture and German order, German discipline. So he was set on reshaping Russia according to the German model. So he kind of was continuing his father's ideas. And just like it was with Peter III, that did not make Paul popular among the Russian elites. So they began convincing his son Alexander that his father was dangerous for the future of the country. And eventually Alexander agreed to support a coup against his father, believing that Paul would simply be removed from power and isolated somewhere away from politics. Instead, during the coup, Paul was killed, and Alexander became the new Tsar, Alexander I. The fact that he had supported the conspiracy against his own father that led to his death haunted Alexander for the rest of his life. And many historians believe that this contributed to his indecisive personality as a ruler, because Alexander often considered reforms and liberalization, but hesitated to fully commit to them. Now, Alexander grew up very close to his grandmother, Catherine the Great. He was educated during the period when Catherine was still strongly influenced by Enlightenment ideas. So Alexander was exposed to concepts of reform, constitution, and liberal political thinking as he was growing up. At the same time, Europe itself was changing dramatically, and these changes would soon have an effect on Russian history as well. After the French Revolution, Napoleon rose to power and eventually crowned himself emperor. And as emperor, Napoleon offered alliances to different European powers, including Russia. But for traditional monarchies, Napoleon was a ruler that emerged from a revolution rather than royal bloodline, and that was dangerous. So Russia rejected the idea of such an alliance, and eventually tensions between Alexander and Napoleon led to war. Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812 with what was considered one of the greatest armies in Europe at this time. And his forces advanced quickly and deep into Russian territory and eventually reached Moscow. But then came one of the most famous turning points in this war, the Russian winter. The French army was not prepared for the harsh conditions, so supply problems started, logistics were falling apart to the point when the invasion completely collapsed and Napoleon's army had to retreat. Again, I'm simplifying. It actually is a very interesting war, so I strongly recommend you look it up if you're interested in the history of wars. Okay, but the retreat started, and then Russian forces pushed Napoleon's army out of Russia, and they kept pursuing them all the way through Europe. Russian military basically helped defeat Napoleon and restore monarchies across the continent. As a result, Alexander I became extremely respected among European monarchs as the Tsar Liberator. So Russian armies entered European capitals as victors who restored the old monarchies. But this victory also created an unexpected consequence. Russian officers, who mostly came from noble backgrounds, spent long periods of time in Europe during and after this war. And what they saw changed them. They noticed that many European monarchies were not fully absolute systems. In several countries, nobles and representative institutions had significant political influence and legal rights. So Russian officers began asking themselves, why does everything in Russia depend entirely on one person? Why shouldn't educated nobles also participate in governing the state? So now the feeling of dissatisfaction that we talked about in the previous lesson began emerging not only among peasants, but increasingly among parts of the educated elite as well. And ordinary soldiers noticed something too. So many Russian soldiers, of course, came from peasant backgrounds. And for the first time, they saw how ordinary people live in different countries. And they saw that their lives were quite different from Russian serfs. And even though peasants everywhere were still poor, the lives of peasants in Europe often appeared less restrictive than those of Russian peasants who were essentially landowners' property. So, by this time, two different kinds of dissatisfaction were developing inside Russia among educated elites influenced by European political systems, and among ordinary people who were getting more and more aware of how harsh serfdom remained in Russia. So, after the death of Alexander I, his younger brother Nicholas became the next Tsar of Russia. And actually, it wasn't a very straightforward process because there was some ambiguity about who should be the next successor, but it's not important for this overview. What's important is that at this point, dissatisfaction with autocracy had already spread among parts of the educated aristocracy, those who were actually close to the Tsar. Nicholas did not fully understand how serious these feelings were until the day when a group of army officers who were representatives of aristocracy and nobility started an uprising. And this event became known as the Decembrist Revolt. Now, notice how different this is from the earlier peasant uprisings we discussed in the previous lessons. And I'm going to make this point again. This time, the people rebelling against the Tsar were members of the elite themselves, those who traditionally stayed very loyal to Tsars. And they were not trying to abolish monarchy, actually. They just wanted constitutional reforms. They wanted Russia to move forward towards a parliamentary monarchy in which the Tsar would still exist, but power would be limited by constitution and representative institutions. In other words, they just wanted something closer to the political systems they observed in Europe. Nicholas reacted immediately. Within hours, he transformed from someone uncertain about ruling into a ruler fully committed to preserving autocracy, which actually wasn't that surprising if you consider his childhood. As a younger grandson of Catherine the Great, he, unlike his older brother Alexander, grew up during the post-Enlightenment era when she was very set on protecting and strengthening autocracy. So Nicholas I ordered the regular army to suppress the uprising, and the Decembrists were defeated pretty quickly. Some of them were executed, others were imprisoned or exiled to Siberia. But the uprising had a profound effect on Nicholas. He became convinced that any liberal ideas were extremely dangerous to the stability of the empire. So as a result, his reign became associated with stronger censorship, political repression, surveillance, and strict control over opposition. So the reign of Nicholas I was again the time for strengthening authoritarian rule even further. At the same time, Russia still saw itself as a major military power after the victory over Napoleon. And that confidence contributed to Russia entering the Crimean War against the Ottoman Empire. And there had been several Crimean wars throughout the Romanovs' rule, some more successful than others, but this war was special in history because it exposed major weaknesses of the Russian Empire. So just recently, they marched through Europe as liberators. And this war, the Crimean War, made it clear that the Russian army was now outdated. Its weapons, its logistics, organization, all of it lagged behind those Western European powers that all of a sudden supported the Ottoman Empire in this war. And in this Crimean War, it became shockingly clear that Russia had fallen behind technologically and militarily. So after that, Nicholas I put effort into trying to industrialize Russia to get it out of its backwardness again. But then he died, and his son, Alexander, became the new Tsar, Alexander II. And unlike his father, Alexander II believed that major reforms were necessary because the society wants them. He understood that Russian people were demanding change. So Alexander II introduced one of the most important reforms in Russian history, the abolition of serfdom. That was a massive transformation. For centuries, peasants had been legally tied to landowners. Now, serfdom was officially abolished. Alexander II also introduced other reforms involving local government, courts, education, and parts of the administrative system. He was even considering a constitution. So in many ways, Russia was slowly beginning to move forward a more modern state structure. So it's a good time to ask my favorite question. How about the commoners? Did their life improve? Has it gotten better or worse? So here, my students are actually divided. Some vote better because, well, the serfdom was just abolished, right? Isn't that a major improvement in freedom and liberties? But others still vote worse because, as I said before, that has been the correct answer throughout my lecture so far, right? And the correct answer is actually kind of worse. Now, the reforms initiated by Alexander II were important, but they moved slowly, and not everyone supported them. Landowners were furious because they were losing enormous power and control over labor without the legalized serfdom. So Alexander II tried to balance reform with protecting the interests of the landowners. And this created a major contradiction. Peasants became legally free, but financially, many remained trapped. Most peasants still depended on land to survive, and in order to continue farming, now they had to rent or buy land from former landowners at extremely high prices. So many peasants left the serfdom but entered long-term debt obligations. So in some ways, serfdom did not disappear completely. It changed form when legal dependency was replaced by financial dependence. Still, this reform was enormously important historically. For the first time, peasants could legally leave the land, and many did. As industry in cities slowly expanded, former peasants began moving into urban areas looking for work, and this process finally helped create a new social class in Russia, the industrial working class, way later compared to Europe. And as I said, Alexander's reforms created new political tensions. Some people believed the reforms were moving too slowly, some people didn't like the reforms at all, and eventually Alexander II was assassinated. And that assassination would have enormous consequences for the future direction of Russia. So, who do you think assassinated Alexander II, the most liberal Russian emperor? Take a moment and think about it. Was it the landlords that were unhappy about losing power? Was it peasants who were still dissatisfied because they basically just changed the form of slavery? Or was it somebody completely different? And the answer actually surprises many people because Alexander II, the most liberal emperor who abolished serfdom and introduced major reforms, was assassinated by nobles who believed he was not liberal enough. So at this point, many educated nobles and aristocrats radicalized because they wanted rapid political transformation, not a slow one. They thought it was long overdue, and it really was long overdue. They wanted a constitution, they wanted limits on autocracy. Some even wanted the monarchy abolished entirely. But Alexander II moved slowly. He introduced reforms cautiously, and then he tried to balance the change with preserving imperial stability. So for more radical groups, that was just simply not enough at this point. And some of these revolutionaries became increasingly extreme, and they began saying that political terror and violence were justified if they could force faster change. So in one of the most famous revolutionary organizations of this time was the People's Will, Народная воля. And it was the members of this group that eventually assassinated Alexander II. So their hope was that removing the emperor would help destroy autocracy and push Russia toward revolution and eventually constitutional government. But most of the Russian society did not support political assassination at this point. Even many people who wanted reforms still viewed the Tsar as a sacred figure connected to the traditional order of the state. Remember how deeply connected the monarchy and the orthodoxy had been throughout the Russian history? So for many Russians, assassinating the emperor still felt like an unthinkable sin. And here on the slide, you can see the picture of one of the most beautiful churches and one of the most famous churches in St. Petersburg. It's called the Cathedral of the Savior on Spilled Blood, and it was built on the site where Alexander II was assassinated. So now, after Alexander II was killed, his son Alexander III reacted in the exact opposite direction. Instead of continuing liberal reforms that the society was waiting for, he strengthened autocracy again. Political opposition was suppressed, reforms were slowed or stopped or reversed, censorship and state control increased. At the same time, Russia again recognized that it was economically and technologically falling behind other European powers. So, under Alexander III, the state pushed for rapid industrialization. Again, I know I've been saying it a lot. It's like it's getting backwards, 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 and somebody pushes for industrialization. So you'll see it again in the Russian history, actually. Earlier, when we talked about ordinary people, we mostly were talking about peasants. But now remember, because many former serfs could not survive economically on the land, large numbers of them began moving into cities. So that was great for the industrialization at this point. So by the late 19th century, Russia was no longer simply a country of nobles and peasants. Now we have peasants, industrial workers, admin folks of different kind, and an increasingly nervous autocratic state, all existing together at the same time. And those tensions would continue building toward the 20th century. Okay, we will stop here, and next time we'll talk about the end of the Russian Empire and the revolutions of 1917. And I did say revolutions, plural, because there were two very distinct revolutions that envisioned very different paths for the new Russia. Thank you.